Hello and welcome to another episode of South Asia Chat, brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Karthik Nachiappan. I'm a research fellow at the Institute, and I work on India's approach towards global governance, focusing on issues like health, trade, technology, and climate change. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking to Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, who's a fellow at the Council of Environment, Energy, and Water, CEEW, which is a think tank, a climate-based think tank in New Delhi. Vaibhav is an economist who leads the council's work on low-carbon pathways, and his research focuses on energy and climate change mitigation policy issues, especially those impacting in India. Vaibhav, welcome. Before we get going, before we start talking about some of the recent developments and issues on the climate change front globally and within India, I want to just get a sense from you of the progress that India has made since the 2015 Paris Agreement, and whether the various initiatives and the strides made since the Paris Agreement have sustained. If you remember, the Paris Agreement requires all countries, all signatories to put forward their best efforts to address climate change through nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to keep global temperature rise this century below 2 degrees Celsius, and to limit temperature increase even further to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, Vaibhav, how has India fared on climate mitigation since Paris?
First of all, thank you, Karthik, for inviting me. Very happy to be here, and hello, everyone. So on just your question on the progress towards Paris Agreement targets, I think India is doing pretty well. And it is, in fact, some of the research has shown that India is one of the very few countries which is on track to, overachieve the Paris Agreement, or rather the NDC targets that India put forward. And so it is going pretty good. On the question of whether pandemic is going to hit it, pandemic is definitely going to hit some of the progress for the, let's say, next year or so. But as far as the 2030 targets are concerned, it is expected that India will achieve it fairly comfortably. So yes, so in that sense, in the next 10 years, we don't see the impact of the pandemic on achievement of targets. It is always possible that India could have overachieved by 10%, and it ended up overachieving by maybe 5, 6, 7%. That is possible, but still, it is going to probably overachieve in all probability. Yes.
So let's now move towards what's been happening over the last month, and so a flurry of climate events has occurred over the past few weeks with President Biden's Global Climate Summit, and even before that, Secretary Kerry, who is the U.S. government's climate envoy, visited India and then China after that. The U.S. under Biden is now hoping for countries like India and China, leading emitters, to deepen commitments on climate and decarbonization. The concept of net zero emissions has now increasingly acquired and attracted much attention. So what does net zero mean? And is it a viable tool or lever for a country like India to achieve desired climate progress?
Yes. So first of all, it is great that the US is back into the game. So that was much needed. On the net zero debate, well, the first thing to understand is what is the net part of it, because it could always be a zero, zero GHGs or something like that. So the net part simply means that you still have an opportunity, or you still have some leeway of continuing to emit in some sectors, while these emissions are being netted by some sort of negative emission or sequestration technologies. So it could be that, let's say, you are emitting 5 units of carbon dioxide, and you are sequestering 5 units of carbon dioxide, let's say, through afforestation, or it could be through technologies like carbon capture and storage. So essentially, net it is zero. So that is the net part of the debate. The second element is, are we talking about net zero carbon dioxide or net zero greenhouse gases? So the debate is essentially about net zero greenhouse gases, right? So it is not just about CO2, it's about net zero greenhouse gases, right? The third element that I want to sort of highlight here is that net zero CO2 versus net zero GHG could have different timelines, and that is very, very important. So we could achieve net zero CO2, let's say by 2050, and we could achieve net zero GHGs by, let's say, 2070, 2075, whatever, right? So these could have different timelines, but ultimately we are talking about net zero GHGs, something like that, right? Now, on the question of is it a viable tool for India, the first important thing that needs to be mentioned as is that we are talking a lot about net zero, and this debate started because US and EU and then China, the biggest emitters, started adopting these targets, and by now I think more than 125 countries are adopted net zero. So of course it's sort of a global climate political movement, that has started in that direction, right? For a fast growing economy like India, the concept of peaking actually goes along with net zero. So it is not just net zero because we are not on a declining trajectory. So if you look at developed world, it's already like peaked long back, and it's on a declining trajectory. India is fast growing fast and emissions are increasing. So even China has talked about 2030 peak and 2060 net zero, when we know that its emissions and its GDP growth is sort of tapering off, right? But India is sort of in the phases where it is expected to grow fast for the next 20 years. So the economic growth is not expected to taper in the next 20 years at least. So peaking and then declining emissions, it's sort of, imagine an inverted V or inverted U kind of curve. So we have to peak and then decline and achieve net zero. So that's a very important element because that has a very different kind of dynamics associated with it, because you have to peak and then kind of go towards net zero. And then ultimately we do think net zero is, it's a long term target, right? There are many commentaries which kind of are saying that long term targets are meaningless, because these are too far in the future, and we should only focus on near term actions. Now, at least CEEW's research and our position is different. We are simply saying it's a false binary to compare short term and long term. Long term is also extremely important, and it is sort of a complementary to short term action. It's not an alternative at all. The way it's being framed in many of the pieces, that it's an alternative. We don't think it's an alternative. Saying that net zero is important in 2070 does not mean that don't act in the next 10 years. Of course, one has to act. There is no disagreement on short term actions. So extremely important. Short term actions are very important. But if you have this longer term target, then your short term actions will guide you towards that target. And we sort of, this happy go lucky approach that, okay, you are doing very well in renewable, then focus on that. Then you are doing very well in electric vehicles, focus on that. That will obviously, reduce emissions, but it is probably not going to take us the pace that is required for a world that is, at least where we have managed to minimize climate impacts. It will nowhere, it will not really take us anywhere close to that kind of world. So that is why this long term target is important. And the final point I want to make on this sort of kind of net zero debate is that for the concept of equity and differentiation is also kind of very important. Net zero does not mean every country has to race and finish that line, cross that line by 2050. Not at all. Every country needs to think about its own net zero paradigm, its own, and a lot of analysis, of course, has to, in stakeholder engagement, has to go in this sort of net zero debate. But yes, ultimately it has to be some sort of bottom up understanding coming from countries, which will give them the confidence that it is a viable tool for me. It is not just something that I am doing because of international pressure. That's very important, right? Yeah, so within that framing is where net zero has to be thought about, and net zero is also a sort of leg up compared to deep decarbonization, because the decarbonization debate is not new, right? But what happened with deep decarbonization is too fuzzy. You could define it in your own way, and you could. So basically, it is deep decarbonization was something that kept everybody happy, right? So India could say that I am reducing my emission intensity of GDP, so I am moving towards deep decarbonization, even though your actual absolute emissions continue to rise, right? So deep decarbonization had that sort of ambiguity around it, which always, obviously, when it is ambiguous, it will make everybody happy. Whoever does not want to move very fast, it will make you happy, right? Net zero sort of takes away that ambiguity. And that is why it is making many countries, sit up and take notice wherever it is sort of very challenging to achieve net zero, or people have not thought about, that sort of formulation of deep decarbonization. Now, net zero is also a formulation of deep decarbonization, right? So wherever countries have till now thought only about this fuzzy and ambiguous definition of deep decarbonization, they have not really thought about this formulation. It is sort of making us a bit uncomfortable, because it is very challenging. Net zero, even if you are able to sequester, let's say, some part through forest, CCS is right now totally unproven technology. So in this sort of setup, moving towards a net zero target does make us uncomfortable, especially the fast growing economies. It will not make US and EU uncomfortable or China uncomfortable, right? It will definitely make India uncomfortable, right? So that is, these are very many different aspects related to, net zero, net zero debate and how India looks at it. And yeah, happy to answer any follow-up questions on this.
Just picking up on your point on India being uncomfortable, do you think is that because of the politics tied to committing toward a net zero goal, or is that related to the fact that it's difficult to acquire these technologies that India can then use for these purposes, or both kind of part of the debate here?
Yeah. So I think the discomfort arises from a kind of lack of understanding of what it takes,
Mm.
right? So because in India, nobody has sort of done this kind of analysis till now, that what it takes. And CW has been the first one to at least put out something, post 2050, that what will it take. And ultimately, see, it's always the decision making process in any country. Let's say, especially I'll talk about India. It will be that line ministries will think about it. Let's say, right? For example, I'll just give you an example. Net zero, whenever it happens, 2050 or 2070, right? It means, first thing, your size of the electricity system is much larger than your sort of reference scenario, right? Just because electrification of the end use sector is a very important strategy. So our estimates say that the size could increase maybe by 50, 60, 70%, and it's a huge number, right? So first of all, the Ministry of Power has to think, right, that I was going at this trajectory. Now my trajectory of electrification has to be sort of at least in the long term, it has to go at least 1.5 times, right? So they have to say, yes, I will be able to do it. Now MNRE, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, has to say that, okay, as our research shows, if CCS is not successful, because as of now it is unproven, so non-hydro renewable energy have to go beyond 80%, in the electricity generation, not the capacity generation, right? Whatever be the net zero here, right? Now, if it goes to 80% in an electricity system, which is, 1.5 times of what was expected in 2050, right? So now MNRE has to say whether we will be able to deliver it, right? So now these are very big questions, right? And all of these questions, ultimately, people have to think about it. So that process, now net zero debate, I really like one aspect of it. It has forced many of us to think about it, because till now people were happy in this larger, as I said, fuzzy deep decarbonization debate, right, where everybody was doing analysis. Now net zero has forced people to explore, and we have put these 4 alternative scenarios, and we are also, obviously, first what we published was an issue brief just to inform the debate, but now we are publishing a more of a detailed paper in the terms of looking at different sectors and all those things. Ultimately, what the objective is, there should be informed analysis, and people who have to make these and implement these decisions have to ultimately say, I will be able to do it, right? It could be manufacturing. It's not just about Government of India ministries. It's also about, maybe manufacturing industry guys. They have to say, I will have to electrify my industry in the next 40 years. So of course, the good part is you give them a sense of time. You're not saying do it in 10 years. And that is very important part about net zero. It's a very strong policy signal. Long-term certainty is always very important, especially from the investor perspective, right? So you tell them, you don't tell them do it in 20 years, but you tell them 40 years from now or 50 years from now, this is what the future we envisage, and you have to be aligned with that future, right? So these industry guys, because these are very important stakeholders, right, and the government listens to them, then they will tell us, they will do their own analysis of their own set of industries. For maybe industries like automobile, it might be easier because these are anyways based on electricity, most of these, but for maybe steel industries, cement industries, it would be obviously much more challenging. These are hard to abate sectors. So they have to tell, well, I will figure it out. It could be electricity based process, it could be whatever, hydrogen, I will figure it out. And they have to give this confidence to the government. So this is how the process works. So, and this is what it will take. The discomfort, as I said, is only because none of that has happened. The discomfort will never be about the political pressure at all. It is just, well, how can I say something when I don't have any understanding of that? So I think what is very good that this process has started. Now various ministries have been engaging with us to really understand, that what does it mean, what it takes. And these kind of process, maybe they don't end up happening in 6 months. It takes time, because all of these other countries, I'm sure they would have taken 1.5, 2 years, looked at this question in a much more sort of analytical way, and build some sort of consensus around it. Only then they would have announced, right? Now the same process will happen in India also. It is not just about CEEW doing its research. Ultimately, it's about consensus building. And once that happens, then I'm very sure India will be able to go ahead and say anything. But that needs to happen. That's very, very important part of it. That needs to happen, right? And there are many, many questions. I'll talk about it maybe in the next few segments. I'll talk about some of the challenges that we see.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about the fact that net zero and these recent developments really compel us to think deeply about mitigation, climate mitigation, but not enough about adaptation, right?
Yes.
How do we get the ball moving on that? Because, we have to think about issues like planning, designing new cities, new forms of transit, creating new parks. So there are a lot of different elements associated with the adaptation side that either might not get enough attention or could be in some way submerged under the discussions right now. Is it possible to keep our focus on both ends, or does adaptation suffer at the expense of mitigation?
Well, yes, you are right. Generally speaking, adaptation does suffer at the expense of mitigation. It does, generally speaking. But many countries like India and whichever country is going to be sort of impacted in a big way, and also does not have the resources, because impact will happen everywhere. It will be whether it's India or China, US, but richer countries will always have much more resources to deal with the impact, and lower income countries will not have that kind of resources. That's why it's a much bigger deal for us, the adaptation debate. So yes, so it is a very important part of the debate, but the way the net zero has been framed, of course, it is a very mitigation centric debate, right? And even the net zero framing does not say that don't look at adaptation. It simply says, well, adaptation is not a part of this framing, but continue to look at adaptation. It does not say anything about, actually does not comment at all on adaptation. So adaptation is an important thing. The larger one thing that is sort of very obvious is also the earlier you achieve net zero, it is much better for climate impacts and adaptation, isn't it? That is also obvious, right? So in that, if we say that world will achieve net zero by 2100, intuitively it's very clear to us it is very bad scenario for climate impacts and adaptation, right? So if you are able to achieve a much more sooner date, or at least minimize the cumulative emissions, so some countries achieve in 2040, some in 2050, some in 670 or so on, you are at least trying your best to harness whatever opportunities are there and minimize the impact, cumulative emissions, which is going to minimize the adaptation needs also. So that is also very clear. But yes, your larger point is very valid. The net zero debate does not comment anything about adaptation, and we should not sort of forget about adaptation at all. It's also a very important part of the debate.
You argued in a recent op-ed in the Hindu that India should inject, and I quote here, equity, differentiation, and justice into net zero debates. Now, equity and justice have been part of India's climate persona since the first FCCC talks in 1992. But since then, India has also become more pragmatic in its climate diplomacy and how it approaches climate change at various global fora. So how should it do this now? And is the NDC a pathway to inject equity, justice, and differentiation?
Yeah. So the one thing that you said is definitely important, that India has become much more practical, which is great, I think, right? And that is exactly why India is also engaging or started engaging in the net zero debate, right? But of course, if you look at the sort of perspectives from civil society coming from India, you would see a variety of perspectives, right? So many people would be saying that this is unjust, and even thinking about net zero is unjust because developed countries are not doing anything, not paying for it, no tech transfer. That sort of narrative still holds because there will always be a section of sort of environmental stakeholders in India who will continue on that path. Thankfully, I think government of India is increasingly becoming practical about it, and uh, so yeah, so that is one thing. On the question of NDC, well, NDC was the bottom of formulation because the world realized that top down formulation, it does not work, and Copenhagen was in a spectacular failure in that regard just because of this pressure tactics went overboard. If there's one sort of approach to pressurize through narratives and all, there's another approach to say that you have to sign on this, and this is what I say and you have to sign on this, something like that went overboard, so it failed terribly. So clearly we are in a regime where everything will happen through a bottom of formulation, you know be it NDC or be it net zero, right? So NDC in that way, when it is anyways bottom up, right? So there was no question of inequity, so to speak. So it's like India has decided whatever it wants to do, right? So anyway, so you're given this choice based on your own national circumstances, which is very important as a principle, right? So that was perfect. Now in the net zero debate also, the I think the issue has been because of this sort of thing about net zero by 2050, and that is confused because the debate on net zero, whether net zero is important, is different from saying net zero by 2050 for all. These are two a very different thing, and the debate has got confused because everybody is talking about net zero by 2050, which is definitely inequitable, which is inequitable, and it is sort of top down. Both of the things which sort of failed, right? But if you just say, well, net zero is important, every country has to think about it, should think about it, analyze, do create consensus, whatever it needs to do. But net zero is important ultimately, and figure out a way that whenever you want to, and practically and reasonably, whenever you think you will be able to achieve net zero, please present that date as well as some sort of roadmap, you know around it, something like that. Now the moment that sort of thing happens, it again becomes a bottom up formulation where countries are themselves doing it. So then this debate of equity will go away. The why we are saying about equity and differentiation is only because of this, that suddenly everybody is from the global point of view saying 2050 is the date everybody should agree, and then 2050 is, of course, it is unjust and it is inequitable. So, and that's why the moment you start introducing equity and justice in that debate, you will end up having a sort of a bottom up approach, which is based on national circumstances and capabilities, which are very important principles, right? So yes, that is what we are saying, that introduce these terms, but ultimately it will have to be some sort of bottom up formulation. Yeah, so net zero is very important. Net zero by 2050 is what we are questioning, right? 2050 for all, right? Yeah.
Invariably, in most conversations about India's climate approach, we have to talk about coal. And since coal is such a big part of India's energy matrix and will be at least for the next generation, can India transition away from coal in the next 30, 40 years? It will entail a fundamental shift in policies, economics, technology, social structures, that have made coal central to India's energy balance. How is coal going to feature here?
Yes, so coal is going to be the most critical part of the net zero debate, right? And as I said, ultimately, when I say, one needs to analyze, and all the line ministries, all the decision makers need to analyze what it will take. One of the most important question is that, well, what do we do with, it is not just about increasing electricity supply or share of renewable energy. The equally important question is, what do you do with all the people who are dependent on coal? So it's about India's, let's say, some states, especially in the eastern part, which are dependent on coal in terms of employment generation for millions of people, as well as their own fiscal resources, which are sort of derived from this fossil source, right? So what do you do with these states? What do you do with 500,000 coal workers? And it's always easy to say these are going to be compensated by solar jobs, which could be right, but well, maybe it's not that these people will start working on solar, right? Because the coal miners are sort of completely unskilled labor, right? Solar will require a lot of, at least some amount of training, It is a much more technical category, right? So we don't expect suddenly these people start working on solar. So those are the hard choices, right? So there are many such hard choices, and coal is a very hard choice that is going to come up for India. So ultimately, the decision, I think, of course, economics is very important, but economics is anyways in the electricity sector at least. It is sort of coming in favor of solar energy, at least in a big way, right? It is definitely slowly moving away from coal. So many states which are further away from mines, it has already started becoming much more expensive because coal transportation is extremely expensive. So whichever state is far from the mines or any coal power plant, they are anyways making a decision not to invest in coal, which has nothing to do with the climate debate. It just makes economic sense, right? Not to invest in coal in those states because power is going to be very expensive. Now places that are closer to the mines, they already have a lot of coal-based capacity, right? Which means bad situation in terms of air pollution. But air pollution has been neglected for long, right? Even though there has been policy now, it has been neglected for long. But the second thing which cannot be neglected, and which is actually where companies are facing a hard sort of wall, is water scarcity, right? And it's very interesting to me. I was speaking at an NTPC conference, I think more than I almost a couple of years back now, and one of the senior NTPC functionaries stood up and said, and I was talking about water energy nexus and what it means for coal power plants in India, the future of coal power plants. And the NTPC senior, I think, person said that 20 years back, whenever we chose a location for NTPC power plant, we never thought about water. No, it was like not even a variable. And now this is sort of one of the most important variables I need to think about, in terms of coal power location. Now that has got nothing to do with climate, right? But it only makes it much more difficult to have coal power plants closer to mines, and air pollution is also increasing the debate. So there are many reasons why coal is going to be hit hard, right? And which is good from the climate perspective. But ultimately, these states and decision makers have to think about what do we do with Coal India Limited. It's a public sector behemoth. What do you do with it? And these fiscal resources for these states, millions of coal sector jobs, the labor unions will always be there. Coal power plants are there, they will probably continue to be operated. And all the new investments that you have made in 2020, they're expected to be there till 2060. The technical life at least 40-45 years. So at some point you need to deal with it, and understanding what it takes is not just about thinking about the pace of expansion of solar energy. It is also about what you do with coal, and it's a very big question in front of us.
So we've talked about the state at the central level, the different agencies, the ministries. We've talked about the firms and how they're going to move toward a decarbonized future. What about the developments at the subnational level? How can states also be part of this conversation moving forward towards net zero?
Yes, yeah. So you're right. Most of the debate, be it decarbonization, be it net zero, happens at the sort of federal level, the central government level in India, and it's each of the states would have its own sort of environment department. But the challenge with environmental debate in India is what within CEEW we call it's a debate at the margins, you know, and we have to mainstream it. And let me give you an example. If we, let's say, look at the speeches made by, let's say, the European Central Bank chief, right? Almost every speech will have some reference to net zero or decarbonization or climate. Every speech, right? The finance ministers talk about it. So ultimately, people who are making these macroeconomic decisions, this climate has become a very important variable in places like European Union, and now it should be there in the US also with this Biden administration. In India, if you look at the comments made by finance minister or chief economic advisor, where climate and decarbonization never figures anywhere. Now that's a very high level indicator for us to tell whether the debate is sort of mainstream or at the margins. So what happens is whenever a group of sort of environmentalists or climate related think tanks, energy people in a room, we keep on talking about as if it's the most important issue. Well, it is the most important issue. I have no disagreement with that. The reality is that the people in the mainstream, uh, they definitely don't think so, right? So somehow this has to be mainstreamed, even at the central level, right? And the same is reflected at the state level, right? All these departments are there. If you look at their state action plans on climate change across states, they will largely be sort of, copy paste of each other, and you will see very similar themes like renewable energy should grow, those kind of themes, they will be there. So now this tells us that this is actually the state of climate debate in India. At the central level, it is increasingly getting important, and that's what net zero will do. The moment you will sort of you understand net zero, and let's say you accept it at the central level, right, after of course the consensus building, that will force everybody to realize that, well, this is happening, because deep decarbonization is too fuzzy. Now the moment net zero is adopted, everybody will sort of wake up and start moving in that direction in a much more coordinated way, right?
Mm.
And in that process, of course, states have a very important role, because ultimately all these things like renewable energy, well, clearly states have a very important role to play in this debate on coal. Well, some of the states which are coal dependent have an extremely important role to play. So of course states have a very important role to play, but the larger framing which we think will be very successful is going to be jobs, growth, and sustainability. It is not going to be climate alone. At the moment we make this debate a sort of environmentalist debate, we lose the audience, right? So we are increasingly making an effort that, well, it is not just about climate or environment. It is about your economic growth. It is about development. It is about jobs, right? So that has to be the framing, because traditionally India, the framing that India has adopted, and I think many countries have adopted, it's just the co-benefit framing, right? The co-benefit framing has been useful, right? But when I've sort of reflect, and I have written many papers which have co-benefits in it as a title or wherever in the content. Now, when I sort of reflect on it, I do think this is one of the framings that probably has not really been successful at all. Climate people have loved that framing, but it's not that any of the decision makers, be it in EU or in India, they've started adopting electric cars because of air pollution. Manufacturers have started investing in electric vehicle assembly lines because of air pollution, or consumers have started buying it. It has never happened like that. So co-benefit framing has been there on paper. Everybody has loved it, like tons of literature. It is one of the core framing in the IPCC assessment reports. I think it has never been, not really been successful at all. So we need to go beyond the co-benefit framing. And what could be successful is this, at least jobs and development sort of framing, because that has clearly made people think about it. So the solar revolution in India is not at all because we want to reduce air pollution. It has been because we want to create a solar manufacturing industry in India, right? Which is about economic growth, development, and jobs. So that is what pushes decision makers, especially in the developing countries, because we want economic growth, we want development, we want energy access. So those are the things. So that's why this framing has to change, and ultimately this framing has to be adopted by at the state level also. At the moment states start seeing that going away from coal is not a threat for me, there's an equally an economic opportunity in the transition which I could leverage. Then it will make it much more easier for state level stakeholders to accept that, well, net zero is something, maybe we should move towards it, something like that. In absence of that, I don't think current way, or the way we are thinking currently, that it's a lose debate for us, and co-benefits, fuzzy co-benefits on paper, then I don't think it is going to change anything.
Yeah. Uh, my last question, and I want to go back to the recently concluded Global Climate Summit, uh, where a key outcome for India was the unveiling of a partnership between the United States and India to expand renewable energy, or 450 gigawatts worth of renewable power, to meet 2030 targets for climate action. I'm guessing this deal was what was most palatable and acceptable at this stage. What is your take on this partnership and this outcome? And do you think we could see more from the Indian government ahead of the Glasgow Climate Conference in November?
Yeah. So on the first question about the deal itself, I think it's a very positive development. That's how I'll put it. So okay. So one thing is to think about these long-term pathways, right? Like what will need to be the state of the future. Those kind of pathways, if you want to achieve net zero, so across sectors and all. Then the second thing comes is, well, thinking about the solution space, and that is absolutely critical. Solution space in the near term, what all do you need to do, right? So one of the most important elements of the solution space is finance, right?
Mm.
And the second is technology availability, right? So we have been developing country, and especially India, have like an amazing opportunity on potential for growth of solar and of many of these things. See the amount that we need, and ultimately what does it mean? It means that we need investments, right? And investment does not mean, right now also investments are happening, but these are too costly. The cost of finance is too high, and we have highlighted this many times through our research, right? So what we found, I think 3 years back, that the cost of finance in the cost of solar based electricity was 70%. 70%. It is huge for India, just because investors saw this as a very risky sector, right? For a variety of reasons. Essentially it was risk premium that
Yeah.
was reflected in this sort of very high cost of capital, right? And what we have realized, of course, it has come down because the government of India has done some very smart things. It is not just about reverse auctions, which is very important intervention, but things like you create dedicated infrastructure to just evacuate. Now these are very important intervention on the ground, which are essentially reducing the risk for investors, that that you will produce solar, it will also be evacuated, and you will also be paid for it because of the must run status. Now these are policy intervention that essentially reduce the risk for investors, right? But ultimately it is capital, low cost capital has to come, and India does not have that kind of capital, right? So ultimately it has to come from private sector, be it Indian or be it foreign private sector. So of course Indian private sector will also be limited, so there's a huge opportunity for foreign investors which have to come to India. But they're simply not coming because in their head it is a much more riskier sort of proposition, right? So it could be a US investor, or it could be a sort of a sovereign wealth fund. They have to invest in India, and low cost. It cannot be a high risk, high cost of capital again, because that again, then what are we changing? So hopefully this sort of deal, a very important element is to think about investments and finance, right? And ultimately, see, we are not asking, at least what CW is arguing, that we don't need grants. You see, we have gotten into this debate of this green climate fund, this 100 billion every year sort of green climate fund. Now that has not materialized in the last 10 years, right? We don't expect it to materialize. Even if it materializes, 100 billion for the world is nothing. We're not talking about like India only. We're talking about world. We're talking about Africa, South American countries, and all those countries, right? 100 billion is nothing. And we are not talking about grants, because grants probably never help. We are saying create smart instruments, sensible instruments, where at least you are able to take off the risk part of it, cover the risk of it. So private investors comes with the capital, but government somehow, and I'm talking about developed countries, the developed countries governments which have money, don't give it this 100 billion grant. Of course, give some part of it to grant wherever it is needed, but use a lot of this money to kind of either pull it in through for taking care of the risk element of the capital, so that low cost capital is available. So you have to think about this sort of solution space, and we hope that through this deal, these kind of things start emerging, right? So this is only one example. Second is co-development of technology. The technology debate is always, technology is innovated and then patent becomes an issue in a big way. So now that has to, somehow needs to be addressed to co-development, because otherwise we'll again go back to the same thing. India will continue to say that this technology is, it's never that technology is not available. It is always that the technology is available, but it is very expensive. So that is what patent means. It is an expensive technology for us, though the technology is available. So India has to somehow, address these sort of issues, and the world has to help India. And this is the way it has to help India, not through grants, but think about actually workable solution. Not like principled solutions, which a grant is a very principled solution, that you created the problem, you are responsible for historical emissions, you pay for mitigation in our country. So it's a very principled stance. I think it's time for us to stop thinking about these sort of principled arguments, and we need to be much more practical. And this is practice. Thinking about these kind of solution is what is much more practical. Right? Yeah. So those are the elements. That's why we think it's very important. Now the Glasgow question, again, I mean, they so what could be the announcement? We don't expect net zero announcement to happen. If it happens, well, it will be great. But again, as I said, there is a process that needs to be followed, that the government of India will follow to understand. If it was sector specific target, and if it was domestic target like 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, That one can always say, because it's not an international commitment. Plus also it is sector specific, and you have actually done some analysis that what does 450 gigawatt mean. Now even 450 gigawatt is challenging just because growth has come down because of not just pandemic, even before that. So right, so when growth comes down, demand comes down. So now absorbing 450 gigawatt is much more challenging than when it was announced, right? So that is also the reality. But the point is, at least when you announced, you had done this some sort of assessment that whether it's possible or not, right? Net zero is about cross sector, it's about the whole economy. Your homework has to be much more solid, and ultimately it has to be an international commitment. So it is sort of 10 times, has to be 10 times more solid, right? So that takes time. All that homework takes times, and there are many elements in terms of feasibility of net zero. It is about the rate of GDP growth, because you have to overpower that. That's overpowering for a growing economy. Then it is about your per capita income, which gives us some sense of resources available to a country, comparatively. That lower per capita income means you have lower sense of resources. Then it's about the gap between peaking and net zero years, because systems don't transition overnight. In 10 years you don't expect the whole economy to transition, right? So there is some sort of gap between peaking year and net zero year. Then there is political economy of the transition, which is essentially things like you have to do a massive reform in your power generation sector, massive pricing reforms. You have to think about Coal India Limited, ONGC, millions of coal workers. You have to think about revenue for railways. Railway is a big, very big enterprise. A lot of revenues come from coal hauling. Coal goes out, its revenues goes out. So now these are the political economy choices. And stranded assets, another very important thing, and ultimately impacts on climate change, in the sense your cumulative emissions. Now all of these are elements that you have to sort of balance somehow. You have to make a very hard assessment to understand all of these. So ultimately any announcement on net zero will have to come after this sort of assessment. And 6 months is probably, it could have always happened, but it's probably too tight for us to assume this sort of thing. Let's see. One could do a sectoral target. Even what would be very good is some sort of enhancement of NDCs. Even that will be also a leg up. It might not be a net zero longer term target. It could be just because there is clearly room for enhancing your NDC. That could be done. There is enough analysis to show it. Now, so that is something that is possible. But let's see what happens. Yes, we are engaged into a debate, so we are also learning and we are informing at the same time. But let's see what happens. Yeah.
Great. Well, we shall all find out very soon. Vaibhav, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Karthik. It was a great conversation. I look forward to continued engagement between us. Thank you.
You have been listening to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. To learn more about our work, you can visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg and also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.